my experience with ketamine just totally reaffirmed that to me, that like the feeling, the experiences you get from psychedelics are so much bigger than just, a trip.
Welcome to the Multiverse, where we believe that mushrooms can actually save the world. Each week, we'll be meeting with thought leaders and experts to extract the best insights and stories across everything from functional fungi, psychedelic medicine, and so much more. Thanks for listening. Step into the multiverse with us. Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Into the Multiverse. Today, we have Ronan Levy, who is the co-founder and executive chairman of FTRP, which I'm excited to dive into and learn more about. I've actually just been to FTRP for my first ever experience. They are a publicly traded psychedelic company and currently focused on ketamine therapy. So honored to have Ronan here with us today and stoked to hear more about your story and everything that you're up to. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. How was your first experience with FTRP?
I think it's a great place to start. I'm really excited to debrief with you. And before I even tell you about the experience, I had an intro to the space probably about 4 or 5 months ago, and went in and saw what you guys have created. And it's in Santa Monica for people that are listening. FTRP has it's the flagship office, I believe, right? Or the flagship center. Has a beautiful space in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. And it's completely unlike any therapeutic setting that I've ever experienced before or heard about, because it's just vibey. You go in and the energy is amazing. It's so beautifully designed. It looks like it's out of a catalog, and you just feel good when you're in there. So it's a space that aesthetically is just like really, really comfortable. And I'm really curious, like what you guys were thinking and why you designed the spaces in that way. I met the designer and spoke with her all about the process. But 70% of the thoughts that we have in any given time are dictated by our environment. And I think it's really important that you guys designed it in that way. So that was my initial intro to the space. And then I went in and did my first intermuscular ketamine experience last Wednesday. And it was one of the most, I think visual is the best overall word, but one of the most visual psychedelic experiences that I've had. And I haven't done intermuscular ketamine before. I've tried ketamine in different formats, but it was a really, really profound experience. And so I'm excited to dive more into it, but overall, like really, 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 really special.
Awesome. That's, thank you for sharing. I mean, I actually had my first ketamine experience ever when I was in LA 2 weeks ago or whenever it was. And it really reminded me about how ineffable these experiences are. Trying to put words to them is just so inadequate. But we do our best to try and share the experience for people who are curious.
Yeah, and I wanna start there, because I know when we had spoken, you shared that you were about to do your first experience. And I know Randy, who's a mutual friend of ours, who you introduced me to, facilitated the experience. But I'm so curious to hear how it was for you, and also, why you've waited to this point to try it for the first time.
Sure. I'll answer the second part of the question first. It was just a function of circumstance, to be quite honest. I mean, I've spent, and this kind of dovetails to, I think, one of the things we're going to touch on is like, how did I end up here doing this with FTRP? And part of the answer is I've spent the last 15 years doing work with meditation, metaphysics, therapy, coaching, you name it. I've probably tried it to more or less degree without psychedelics. I had never tried psychedelics. Growing up, I was actually pretty anti-drug, let alone, being a psychedelic entrepreneur at the time. So my experience with psychedelics was extremely limited until we left the cannabis industry in 2018. And we learned about what was happening with psychedelics. At the time, Michael Pollan had just published How to Change Your Mind. MAPS had just been given breakthrough therapy designation. I remember vaguely hearing about Peter Thiel making an investment in some psilocybin company. And then we started looking into what was actually happening. And I was like, whoa, this is really exciting. And having done all the work without psychedelic drugs up to that point in my life, I was like, psychedelics may be the platform that gets people to start thinking about the world in a way somewhat similar to me in terms of understanding the value of doing all this work, doing the emotional work, doing the spiritual work, stuff that, still for probably 95% of the world, just like, I'm not going there. I'm not interested. I'm fine. Everything's totally cool. Like I'm fine. Right. And that's how I was for the first 30 years of my life until I realized that I actually wasn't fine. And really had a lot of processing to do. So psychedelics were new to me until 2018. And before we started Field Trip, even though we were keen on doing something in psychedelics, we're like, well, we need to experience this. We need to know what we're talking about before we start this so we can talk about it genuinely. And so I had a few psilocybin experiences, but ketamine never made it to the top of the list. And then just as we were about to open our Toronto clinic, two things happened. One is we got guidance from the College of Physicians and Surgeons in Ontario, basically saying that access to ketamine for mental health purposes has to be very restrictive in the province of Ontario, which meant that our doctors couldn't actually administer to us in Ontario. The guidance in other states and jurisdictions is much more flexible. In Ontario, it's pretty rigid. So that wasn't going to happen. And also, we happened to open our Toronto location in mid-March of 2020, which was a pretty bad time to be opening a business because of a pandemic that was swooping down through the world at the time. So there was just no opportunity. And so to do it in Canada was just not going to happen from a regulatory perspective. And I didn't travel outside of Toronto, the Toronto area until 2 weeks ago when I went to LA. So that was the first time I was in a place where the regulations actually enabled me to access the treatment. And so that's why it took so long for me to have an experience. That was a very long-winded story, but I figured I'd offer all details.
Yeah, no, I think it's important context because you guys, I mean, you really started during the pandemic, or at least taking off during that time. And I mean, you weren't able to travel until that point. So I mean, how was the experience? I'm so curious to hear about it.
It was intense and enlightening. My experience was, I don't know if this happens to you, but anytime I've done a psychedelic experience, my first thought is always like, is this working? When is this going to kick in? And so like, that was my first thought, being like, should something be happening by now? And then it starts and I'm like, oh, something is happening now. And I felt like I was transported into the inner workings of the universe. Like I got a deep sense that I was witnessing, how people who have intense psychedelic experience talk about, they feel like how you can feel the spiritual energy of the universe, whatever it is, but like that pulsing, vibrating life that is the universe that science can't measure. And most hyper rational people would say it doesn't exist, but anyone who's kind of like tuned into it can kind of tune into it. I felt like I witnessed that. I was in the midst of it. Kind of felt like the Matrix kind of thing. In the Matrix movies, you see all the binary numbers coming down like this. It wasn't so kind of constructive. It wasn't so like binary and computer like, but it had that similar kind of feeling of like very rhythmic, very geometric kind of shapes, just pulsing and moving and pulsing and moving. Um, I felt connected to like, wow, there is definitely an existence that operates on Earth on a different plane than our conscious minds can usually tap into. But it was very intense, and it was, it kind of felt like there was a life to it, but it didn't. What it showed me is that not all life is as wondrous as we get to experience as a human. Like that human life is actually a really unique experience in, the times we emerge from this dream soup into an individual, and then eventually we get pulled back into it. And so what it showed me was just like, yeah, there is life after life. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But the experience we get to have as a human being right now is really fucking cool. Excuse my language. And it's really special. And we get to experience sensations and tastes and wonders in a very unique way. So enjoy every aspect of it. Really make the most of it, because even though it does, life continues on afterwards, which was the sense I got from the experience. This version of it is very special. That was my experience. So it made me feel a lot of gratitude for my wife and my kids and everything I have in my life, when sometimes it's easy to get too sucked into the things that are frustrating or aggravating or annoying or boring or anything along those lines. It really gave me a healthy dose of gratitude.
Wow. And is it something that after, now after having done this experience, is it something you're planning to continue? Are you planning to, revisit ketamine and, use it in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm still subject to some of the same limitations, which is in Toronto, which is where I live. I don't have access to legal ketamine. I mean, I can always go
Mm.
sort of underground, but that's not my preferred course. So it will be restricted to probably when I travel to the LA area. I will probably have another experience, but it won't be anytime soon. I don't imagine, not because I'm opposed to it, but just because I don't expect to be traveling too much through the end of the year.
Amazing. Well, thanks for sharing the experience. And is this your first interview that you've done since you've had, you've tried ketamine?
Yeah, this is the first conversations I've ever had about it. So, I mean, obviously, I shared it with my friends and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, this is my first debrief on it for sure.
All right, amazing. Well, I'm glad we're able to document it. And, just to share, when you said something about your experience, it reminded me of mine. And, the most difficult thing, and actually one of the most comical things is listening to someone try to describe their psychedelic experience, because, there's just such limited language for especially the visuals that someone experiences on psychedelics. So unless you have a really, really elaborate language palette to choose from, like, it's very difficult to describe. The limited language that we have to describe, our psychedelic experiences is actually one of the most interesting and, like, comical things to listen to, in my opinion. And, what you described, and actually my experience with ketamine specifically, is more of that matrixy, like, inorganic visual experience. Whereas, if you have a psilocybin experience or different psychedelics, the visuals you experience are more from nature. And my particular experience with this was one of the most visual experiences I've ever had. And I felt like I was watching a movie, but it was like a full matrix style, colorful movie that was playing in front of my eyes. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was fully immersed in it. And it was fascinating, but it traced the colors of the rainbow. So I don't know if you've heard a similar experience. I talked to Randy about it, who facilitated it, but it started with red and yellow, and then it went through the rainbow, and each color was a different scene. So, I got a lot of personal spiritual downloads from the experience, but it was also just remarkable to see, because I felt like I was just in this 3D globe watching all of these um, incredible visuals all around me, which is just, it's one of the most interesting experiences I've had. And there was a lot of, downloads connected to that, but I just thought I'd share it because this is fascinating.
That's super cool. I'd love to hear about the actual spiritual downloads if you don't mind sharing about them. But B, one of the things that I think is important, and I don't think most people put enough stock in, is like how transformative the energy of beauty is, right? Like I have no
Mm.
idea what you experienced, but it sounded quite beautiful. And just the experience of beauty, not always just in the aesthetic sense. Beauty can exist on a much more emotional level and all that kind of stuff. But when you have those experiences, it's like life is never the same after you've had, a true experience with beauty. Maybe it kind of moves out and then kind of comes back in, and it's very close to being the same, but you're fundamentally different when you've experienced that kind of level of experience. And I'm just putting words in your mouth right now, but it sounds like
Yeah.
that could have been one of those experiences.
Yes, and, just to bring it back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that, someone who's an incredible experience designer shared that statistic with me about the 70% of your thoughts being dictated by your environment. And in a very similar way, like, the reason why you've designed the field trip, you know, centers to be so beautiful is, the mindset that you are in when you're in an environment like that, when you're in a beautiful home, when you're in a beautiful landscape, like, you're thinking and feeling differently. Like, it actually changes the chemistry of your body in that state. And, one of my, to answer your question about the spiritual downloads, I was fascinated just by what I was seeing. But during the blue session of the rainbow, I had the blue album. I had an actual person appear in it, and it was kind of like it actually looked like an avatar person. And there was all of these moving things happen, but it kind of like locked in and zoomed up. It was almost like a 3D thing coming at me, not in a scary way, but it locked in and this blue eye opened at me. And it sounds, I mean, it sounds crazy, but it was so real at the time. And what he said to me, and so I heard it not in a voice, but I heard it in my head. And it just said, remember why this is important. And obviously, a lot of the work that I'm doing with the Multiverse, and we're launching our own brand, Supermush. It's specifically in the functional mushroom space. But the reason why we have things like this podcast is to educate on all psychedelics and be supportive of companies that are working in that space, like the field trips of the world, to get their message out there. And that's kind of, it's the underlying mission of everything that we're doing. And so it was just kind of like a reaffirmative reminder of remember the mission and remember why this is all really important. So that was, that was one of them. There was a lot of other little miniature downloads that came through, but just to have that verbally, spoken in my head or however it came through was really, really profound. And I'd love, I know we jumped right into kind of we jumped right into chatting about your experience, but I'd love to kind of take it back for people that are listening. Obviously you can look up on the internet what Field Trip is, and you can kind of get an idea of what you guys are doing, which I'd love you to share personally. But one of the first questions I have for you is when you were a kid, were you ever thinking that, decades later in life, that you would be running a psychedelic public company that is putting people's brains in a neuroplastic state and allowing them to change their consciousness and transform their lives, which is essentially what Field Trip is doing. But like, can you close the gap of how did you get there?
Sure. I'll try to do it as briefly. And no, I can assure you that of all the people who graduated in my 1997 graduating class from Westdale Secondary School, I would have been the one voted least likely to be starting a psychedelics company sometime in the late 20 teens. What do we call it? The aughts? I don't know what the late 20 teens are called. With one caveat, which is I think people who know me well enough knew that like I was genuinely, contrarian enough, rebellious enough, not in a confrontational, like getting angry at your parents and doing a lot of drugs and getting tattoos and doing stupid shit kind of way, but just a person who would be like, anyone who's going to do something crazy like that or stupid like that or just so off the wall like that, I would be it. But when it came to drugs, I was pretty much anti-drugs. I didn't drink in high school. I didn't smoke pot in high school. I didn't do anything in high school. Not entirely because it was so dogmatically principled, more that I had a really bad experience with some medicine when I was around 15 that made me feel spaced out for weeks at a time, using it legitimately, and it scared me. And I'm like, I never want to ever feel like that again. So the idea of like intentionally intoxicating yourself seemed like a really stupid idea. But then a breakup after second year of university encouraged me to start exploring with alcohol, and I was like, oh, this is what I've been missing. And since then I've been, I guess, making up for lost time when it comes to exploration with, I guess, booze and alcohol. I've never really waded into any heavy drugs. Those still scare me, and I don't see a whole lot of utility for them. But my path briefly was always entrepreneurially inclined, from high school and that kind of stuff, but very much on a good Jewish boy path of becoming a lawyer. So I did business in undergrad and then went straight to law school. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. God knows why. But as soon as I got to law school, I looked around and I still have some wonderful friends from high school, but I realized this is not the space I want to be in. This is way too conservative, follow the right path. And I was always a person who never liked to be on the right path. I always liked to be a bit contrarian, go elsewhere. And so following law school, I practiced law for a while, but was always looking for different ways to get out. Ended up working for Much Music and MTV in Canada. Did some digital media stuff, which was kind of cool. That was right before the latest kind of tech boom, or around like 2008, 2009, when it was just startup world everywhere, and everyone was trying to start an app and all that kind of stuff. So left the practice of law, opened my first business, Oh no, actually, it was an important experience when after I left Much Music and MTV, I went to work for an online dating company, and that online dating company, had a whole bunch of different dating sites, some from the mundane, some the provocative and shocking. And what I learned in that experience is that there's a lot of opportunity wading into areas that people feel gross or are gross or icky or anything along those lines. And if you bring legitimacy and transparency and honesty and, genuinely believe that there's good to be had from, working in those spaces, then there's a great opportunity to be had. And so actually my first business that I ever started was actually a cash for gold business, which is generally an industry that has a terrible reputation. But we chose to do it and bringing legitimacy and authenticity and transparency to it and really trying to change the name. And we made a great little business doing that by treating people fairly as opposed to trying to take advantage of them like most people in the cash for gold industry will do. So it taught me a lot, that online dating experience company or the online dating company experience and the Cash for Gold company showed me that there's great opportunities to do that. I had no ambitions of being a Cash for Gold guy for my entire life. So as soon as we could hire management to run that company, we did. And I went back to freelancing law, doing freelance legal work with startups because that's really where I wanted to be in the kind of tech space. And through that work, I ended up meeting a couple of guys who would become my business partners in our cannabis business and this business. They were looking at all sorts of different opportunities, having previously started and sold a business. And one day, like we just sat down to run through a whole bunch of opportunities that they had written on a whiteboard. And being entrepreneurial as well as a lawyer, I kind of went through bad idea, bad idea, bad idea, bad idea, bad idea. And then I was like, yeah, basically all these ideas are shit. I don't remember being so gruff, but apparently that's what I said. And then as I was leaving, Joseph, one of my business partners, was like, well, there's this one other opportunity. I'm like, oh, what's that? And he's like, well, the rules around medical cannabis in Canada are changing. And so, doing like an online marketplace for medical cannabis, kind of like Leafly for most of the American listeners out there, but for Canada specific. And I'm like, why aren't you doing that? And they're like, wow, cannabis, it seems so shady. Like, we don't really want to attach our names and reputation to a weed business. And I'm like, guys, like I've been a corporate lawyer. I've been a pharmaceutical lawyer. I've been like a media lawyer. I've been a cash for gold buyer. That's maybe the most legitimate thing that's going to help my reputation as opposed to harm it. So if you guys aren't going to do that, I'm going to do that. I had no particular fondness for cannabis at the time. I had smoked pot maybe 3 or 4 times in my life, but I saw a real opportunity to do something pretty fun and exciting for something that I knew was going to be big. And I was, agnostic to skeptical at best as to the therapeutic benefits of cannabis, but I was open-minded enough to say, at least philosophically, if all we did was give people access to weed without getting arrested, that was good enough because the war on drugs is stupid. So we started that business, and what we found is that cannabis was an incredibly potent, effective therapeutic option for a lot of people. We helped hundreds of thousands of people in Canada who were genuinely suffering get access to medicine that was effective for them. Sometimes all it did was help them sleep, but that was enough to make their next day better. And so it was incredibly rewarding. So really opened our eyes to the potential of these stigmatized medicines or plant-based medicines, some things that I wasn't terribly interested in, or neither were my co-founders, but we came in with an objective lens and an objective perspective, did really good work, helped a lot of people, and it really changed a lot of lives. So after we left that and learned what was happening in psychedelics, we're like, well, we just scaled in at least superficially, very similar business. Is there something to do in psychedelics? So we started researching, saw that the evidence was profound. I had done a lot of work with meditation and coaching, like I mentioned before. And so I knew the impact that opening people's minds to spirituality and emotionality and dealing with their shit can have on their lives, because I saw how much it affected my life. So I had a particular fondness and passion for it, not having experienced psychedelics to that point, but open-minded enough after having my mind changed by cannabis early on. And so we started spending some time researching it. I was hell-bent on figuring out how to open a business in psychedelics, even though unlike cannabis, which had just been legalized, there was no clear path to or no obvious path to doing psychedelics. But after a bunch of time, we realized there were a couple of opportunities. One was working with ketamine, and that's become Field Trip Health and the clinics that we're opening. Ultimately, our view is to work with everything: psilocybin, synthetic mushrooms if we can, MDMA, and so on and so forth. And we actually started a cultivation facility in Jamaica. I think the world's first legal research and cultivation facility for psilocybin producing mushrooms. Because what we knew from the cannabis industry, having sold our clinics business to Aurora, was that scaling cultivation of these products like cannabis is not as easy as just building a bigger box and hoping it kind of grows exponentially. It takes a lot of sophistication and effort to make sure things scale in a way that is safe and meets all analytical testing requirements and all the things that I expect are going to apply to any psilocybin mushroom industry. And so we signed a partnership, an exclusive partnership with the University of West Indies. And out of that, Field Trip was born. Now, Field Trip has evolved in any number of ways since then, but that was the kind of genesis story.
Wow. And so, it sounds like what's really interesting, just about your path versus other people that I've spoken with in this space is you actually came into it without, a lot of people have started companies in psychedelic space after going to Costa Rica, Peru, what have you, having a transformational ayahuasca experience, having a profound experience with mushrooms, and then that being the genesis of their experience. So you're coming at it from a different angle. What are your thoughts on that? And I'm sure, I don't know if this is something people ask you a lot, but can you kind of answer that? And then also just in parallel, how has your experience now having done ketamine, has it kind of changed or reaffirmed anything about the way that you're going about the business model?
I think coming into it somewhat objectively, not from the lens of being an advocate and wanting to start a business, but seeing an opportunity and wanting to build something on that gives us a lot of credibility, right? I mean, certainly we saw in the cannabis industry, a lot of the early movers in the industry were, pot enthusiasts, which there's nothing wrong with that. But when you're an investor, looking to write a check for 6 figures or 7 figures or more, um, a lot of the antiquated notions of who someone who uses cannabis is still come to play. And so being able to walk into a room being like, listen, we're not cannabis guys, we're not psychedelics guys, we're sophisticated entrepreneurs and operators who see a real
Mm.
opportunity to execute on what's going to be a great business and create a lot of impact. I mean, we were mostly impact driven, certainly uh, economically driven as well, but all of us had done very well in the cannabis industry. So it wasn't just a quick scheme for us with psychedelics. It really was, can we create an incredible amount of impact? And that just gives us a level of credibility, to be quite honest, with a whole audience of people who, still play host to all of those tropes about who drug users are. Even if consciously
Mhm.
they say like, oh, I don't care, subconsciously, it still affects a lot of people. So it gave us an avenue up. And it also enabled us to see some of the, there's a lot of, I guess, myths in the psychedelics industry about how things have to be done a certain way. And if you don't do it that way, you're either, doing something dangerous or you're, um, you're, what's the word I'm looking for? You're vandalizing something sacred or anything along those lines. And coming in objectively,
Mhm.
being like, we're not taking anything as given. We're going to look at everything fresh because we have to, because we don't know anything. I think gave us a lens of opportunity to try and innovate. Because one of the biggest challenges we have, around psychedelics is scaling, like the cost and the time frames and all that kind of stuff, let alone the legal issues, makes it a really difficult thing to make affordable and accessible to a lot of people. And so, as much as I think everybody in the psychedelics industry or the psychedelic space wants to see robust access, it's not an easy problem to solve. And it's going to take some sophisticated operators to figure out how to make this genuinely available to a lot of people. And I'm not saying that because capitalism are better or worse. I just think, the operational problem solvers out there are the ones who are going to figure this out, and they tend to work in business more so than in other areas. Anyway, all that's
Yeah.
to say is like I think coming in objectively, it has helped us be innovative and helped us build credibility to an audience that may have been skeptical because we had that degree of objectivity coming into the conversation. There was a second part of your question, which I'm drawing a blank on now.
I'm drawing a blank on it too. I think you answered it.
I think you
No,
asked like my experience with ketamine has changed my perspective.
yeah.
No, I mean, I think my experience with ketamine was exactly what it needed to be. And I would encourage, anybody who's struggling with any kind of mental health challenge. I don't even like the word mental health challenge. I think it's so inadequate of a way to describe it. It makes it feel like it's our brain. And this isn't about our brains. Like, that's the thing. It's like, really, it is partly our brains, but it's our body, it's our minds, it's our souls. Like, I don't, there's no, again, like trying to describe a psychedelic experience, trying to describe the essence of what it is to be human, is really what's at play when we talk about psychedelic experiences. It's not just our neurochemistry, it's a very spiritual experience. We talk about the impact of the mystical effect, and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, that's more than just our neurochemistry. That's just more than just our brains. I have a friend who works for a company called Heart Math, which, part of their science is about measuring like the energy that actually comes off your heart, which is actually measurable, right? And the frequency. So it's like we do give off vibes, whether you like to talk about energy or not. We as humans, we give off vibes quite literally. And so I'd like to get to a point of recognizing that this is a lot more than just talking about our brains or our mental health. It's a lot more. It's like our human health, or, the word that comes back to me is isness. It's like, this is just what we are, and it's all integrated. And I think separating it and compartmentalizing it, as allopathic medicine has done for the last 100 years, has been fantastic, because we've done incredible work in terms of advancing human longevity and all that kind of stuff. But we got to get back to the point now, I think, where we recognize that the whole human experience is body and mind and spirit. And so, my experience with ketamine just totally reaffirmed that to me, that like the feeling, the experiences you get from psychedelics are so much bigger than just, a trip, to speak glibly. And that was a great motivator and a great reminder of why we're doing what we're doing.
Amazing. I have like 4 different questions that just spun out of what you said, but I'm just kind of gonna go in order. Number one, you talking about going into these rooms and raising, Field Trip has raised a lot of money, and obviously you guys are a publicly traded company, and because of your backgrounds, you were able to I guess, legitimize yourself for investors, because of your previous experience, which I think is really important to note. And in a similar way, I was recording a podcast earlier talking about my own experience coming into psychedelics and what figureheads brought me into it. And it was people that were not 60s and 70s hippies that changed my perspective. It was the Tim Ferrisses and Michael Pollans of the world that built their audiences in business and wellness and then decided to legitimize psychedelics. And that is what's so important. And, before we started recording, you were telling me about a question that you just asked to Elon Musk about the importance of psychedelics. And now that Elon Musk, there's this viral answer to your question that Elon, that's going all over the internet about Elon legitimizing the importance of looking at psychedelics and how important they are to human potential. And now that Elon has put that out to his audience that doesn't follow him, to my knowledge, at all for psychedelics, it's continuing to grow the audience because people are coming at it from different vantage points. And that's how you really drive culture, right? And so I think that's really important to note. And part of the reason why we're doing this podcast and trying to, is part because we want to normalize it and have successful people speak about its legitimacy. We were joking about the importance of having the Oprahs of the world talk about psychedelics, but could you imagine if her audience heard her legitimize something that she would never, if you look at the typical things she talks about, it wouldn't feel like that was the next thing that's going to come out of her mouth. But that's so important. That's like thing number one. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And my question about specifically what you mentioned on, maintaining connection to indigenous roots and things of this nature. I talk about this all the time. And I'm from Missouri, which is a completely different world than the world I live in right now in Los Angeles. And for someone in Missouri to go to, South America or Central America and do an ayahuasca retreat feels much less likely than maybe the typical stereotypical person that lives in Los Angeles or any of these Western, these, kind of coastal cities. But what would be more accessible to them is, let's say there was a field trip that popped up in the middle of America in my hometown in St. Louis. And, the typical healthcare system that someone's been interacting with. That's why, I'm really interested in how people are going to bring synthetics and things of that nature to market, because it's much closer to home for people that would feel more comfortable opening their mind to psychedelics because of that. So I'm just curious on, on what your perspective is, because I think Field Trip is going after a very different type of audience. And you're really, I think, focused on legitimizing psychedelics for someone who maybe would not be open-minded to it otherwise. So can you just kind of speak about that a little?
Yeah, that's exactly it. When we started, I had this kind of archetype of, and I don't know why I picked Pittsburgh, but it was Pittsburgh in my head, like a 28-year-old Pittsburgh bro who would probably rather be dead than ever be caught in a therapist's office. And I was like, it's going to take a long time to convince that person to go talk to a therapist about his feelings, about his childhood or anything along those lines. But could I get that guy to try mushrooms sometimes? Yeah, probably. And that was kind of the math, being like, oh, okay, this is how psychedelics, actually have massive impact. It's not having everybody have transformative psychedelic experiences and giving up their jobs and moving to Peru and becoming a shaman. It's not that at all. It's about creating that wedge experience, being like, oh my God, I forgot how much anger I have towards my father when he did that, and I'm actually in a space where now I'm going to talk about it or whatever it is. I'm giving a very mundane example, right? If we can give that tiny experience to millions of people, we will change the world more so than putting, a person on Mars, right? Like, I've been reading *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari. I don't know if you've read that, but he talks about how the agricultural revolution didn't happen overnight. It was just kind of one of those things, being like, oh, I found a lot of blueberries here, and then the next year there's like a great harvest there, and it's like, oh, I have some extra seeds, and oh wow, I'm getting, like, now I can bury them and create more harvest, and so the agricultural revolution was just over a number of generations, these very tiny increments where we went from hunter gatherers to people living in villages, and then all of a sudden we're farmers, right? And it was just very incremental, tiny, tiny, tiny steps. And I can see, if we give people just tiny steps towards greater emotional awareness or healing or spirituality, just tiny steps, even if it doesn't change their lives substantially, will change the world. In like 2 generations, this world will look entirely different. So that's always been what we're trying to do, is how do we make this accessible to the people who are not even thinking about it? And we still really want to lean into the psychedelic experience. There's a lot of people who are trying to medicalize it heavily. And I think that's part of the process, because I think you need to get the medical community on board before this really becomes something that becomes widely accessible. But we also want to reintroduce the conversations about, emotionality and spirituality and isness and all these other kind of things, which doctors aren't going to talk about, but I think are an instrumental part of how psychedelics can transform people. And so we're really trying to walk that fine line. You're absolutely right. That is our goal. Our goal is to open this up, and one of, I guess, the blessings that I've received in life is that, like, I'm entirely ordinary, and for some reason people find my ordinariness to be very approachable. So when I say, like, hey, have you ever considered psilocybin assisted therapy or ketamine assisted therapy, it's not like, I'm a lunatic or I'm a fringe person coming to talk to someone and it's like such an outlandish suggestion. People stop and take my suggestions somewhat seriously, because I don't present as being an advocate or, having some sort of policy objective or anything along those lines. I come across as being balanced. And actually, at Code Conference, where that Elon Musk quote came from, Scott Galloway, who's on the Pivot podcast and the Prof G podcast, was commenting, I think he said it on the Pivot podcast, that he's interested in Field Trip because we're like the quote Williams Sonoma of psychedelics, which means it's like an approachable brand and we seem credible. And then, his comment about me was that, I seemed very level headed, and that gave him a lot of comfort. And I think that's really important that, when we talk about psychedelics, we are very level headed. So the people who are skeptical, don't have those immediate defensiveness go up of like, oh, that guy's just a weirdo. I'm like, don't trust him. It's like, it's hard to, I guess I'm a very approachable person, so it's not always easy to write me off as being a fringe lunatic that quickly. So I get
Mhm.
people to think about things a little bit deeper than they might have if they heard it from, a Joe Rogan or someone with, dreadlocks or anything along those lines. I wish I could grow
Yeah, well, I think,
dreadlocks for the record,
essentially,
but
Yeah, I never say never. But I think what you're saying is your avatar is something that a lot of people that are maybe skeptical about the space resonate with, and just because of that, inherently they're more open minded. We're just as humans more likely to, which is actually unfortunate because a lot of the best ideas come from diversity, which is will lead into my next question. But we're more likely to adopt opinions of someone that looks like us and sounds like us. But that being said, the best, cultural change and some of the best ideas come from collaboration from completely diverse mindsets. And I think that's super important. How do you guys think about diversity within Field Trip, not just even from, different genders and ethnicities from that perspective, but also just from representation on people that have been working with these medicines for thousands of years? Like, how are you collecting thought partners around you to make sure that you're, going about the space with integrity?
yeah, I mean, we're just trying to be conscious about it. Like, there's no concrete answer I can give. I mean, I know that I'm not very actively involved in the day to day hiring, but I know our team of people who are very focused on ensuring that we have a diverse range of voices actually working in the clinics. And from the get go, I mean, it wasn't so much focused on a person's, race or ethnicity, but we sought to get a whole bunch of voices around the table from psychiatrists to psychologists to psychotherapists to underground therapists to, drug guides and all that kind of stuff to help us inform our protocols. Did we specifically go out and seek indigenous shamans? No, we didn't. But I think a lot of the indigenous wisdom was baked into some of the advice that we had gotten through other people. Through the conversations we've had. So, and then as we build out our teams now, we're actively working to, make sure we have diverse voices, a range of backgrounds and personalities and psychographics around the table at all times. In part because, the marketplace of ideas, usually floats the best one. So having all those perspectives helps, but also to ensure, as much as um, it's a negative to uh, be more receptive to ideas from people who look and sound like us. Especially if you're in a marginalized community, I think it's probably instrumental to get people to feel more comfortable to working with these modalities, working with people that they look at and know and trust. And so it's important from that perspective as well. So
Mhm.
hmm
all that's to say is like we've been conscious about it. I don't have any sort of specific concrete things that we've done, but in some respects, I like that more because we can be conscious about it as opposed to dogmatic about it and working against like, well, we must have X, Y kind of protocols because, this has to be the way. It becomes rigid and rigidity is the opposite of creativity. And I think what we're talking about at the heart is creativity is how do we blend
Mhm.
all of these different perspectives to come up with new ideas, new innovations, new ways to help people. Um, and so, yeah, that's just the approach we've taken to date.
Yeah, and how do you guys think about, just to expand on that, how do you think about partnership and competition? Because, if you look at the psychedelic landscape, when Fields Trip started, it was a totally different world. And now, there's an, it's every single month there's a new update on how many, I think it's $2 billion that have already gone towards investment in psychedelic companies, but it's growing exponentially. How do you guys think about partnership, about companies you want to collaborate with, and how do you think about just the overall, I think competitive landscape is a weird term to use when it's coming to psychedelic medicine, because if everyone is successful, then the world gets, you know, the mental health crisis that the world is facing. I know it's like we talked about that terminology. It's more of just like the overall wellness of the world gets better. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I work with a gentleman named Erwin Perlman. He's based in LA actually, and he was telling me recently that in ancient Greece, competition was not defined as like the pursuit of winning. The purpose of competition, the spirit of competition, was to bring out the best in your competitor. That was your goal. You upped your game not for purposes of winning or destroying the competition. You upped your game solely because it would force your competitor to up his or her game as well. And that's how you accelerated and improve society. That was the role of competition. That notion of competition has since morphed terribly in sort of the modern Western context, but I'd love to get back to that. And that's kind of how I view competition, which is everybody out there who's competing with us. Our goal is not to undercut them and put them out of business, but to learn and get better. And, as we learn and get better, they will learn and get better. And then we'll all collectively get better and better. I'm a believer that with the right parameters and the right intention, capitalism can be a race to the top as opposed to the race to the bottom. It doesn't always have to be a race to the bottom. It often ends up that way. But I think if we change our mindset around what we're trying to do, we can do well and do good at the same time. I'm a big believer in that. When it comes to competition in the psychedelic space, the truth is that like our clinics can only hold so many people. These are time intensive experiences, and there's only so much space. And so even if we hit absolute max capacity for our projected number of clinics over the next few years, it's like we're helping a handful of people realistically relative to the size of the U.S. population. So competition right now is fantastic to the extent that the competitors are doing good quality medicine and showing great results and helping people, and that gets those people to talk about their experiences more and continue to create awareness for psychedelics and their potential. Then I'm all for competition. Like I really think it is a situation where a rising tide floats all boats. Maybe it doesn't always end up that way, and I think there's a risk when it's a saturated market that people will start undercutting and the quality of experiences will go down and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think that's a reason not to get to that point and then address it then. But I still think that's a long time away, to be quite honest. So I don't spend too much time worrying about that. We're just focused on doing what we do well, and continuing to execute on that and bring it to market and help more people access it. In terms of partnerships, I think we're mostly like just opportunistic. Like right now, our focus is just doing what we set out to do, which is open up our clinical infrastructure, make these therapies as accessible as possible, innovate on therapeutic protocols like group sessions. And I think we're, be launching couples therapy soon and all that kind of stuff. So really cool stuff. And if great partnerships come along, fantastic. But we're not by and large out looking for them too much, because we have our plan and we're just focused on trying to make it happen right now and trying to build the expertise and the capacity to do that from the inside.
Got it. And, this kind of leads to, one of the last things I want to ask you about. And it's interesting because when we've been doing these podcasts, it's kind of nice because we're starting with the journey of the person. And then by the end of the podcast, we land on, it's like a cliffhanger on what exactly is the thing. So for people that are not familiar with Field Trip, obviously we've dropped in little nuggets and you can guess at what the experience is, but what is the user journey for someone that comes in to Field Trip? Who are you currently serving? Where are you operating? Can you just give like a landscape of what you guys are doing?
Yeah. So we have 9 locations. Sorry, I keep losing track. Across North America and one in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, it's unique because we can work with psilocybin-assisted therapies using truffles, which is super cool. I haven't had a chance to go there for the same reasons. I only had my first ketamine experience a couple weeks ago. But what the user journey is like is we screen everybody. We want to make sure that our therapies are both medically and psychologically appropriate. By and large,
Mm-hmm.
ketamine assisted therapy is quite safe and it is generally appropriate for most people dealing with any range of mental health challenges. But part of what we're doing is to try and create legitimacy. So one way to do legitimacy is play by the games of the medical community, not by the games, play by the rules of the medical community, which means we're treating people who need it, and not using medicine frivolously. Now, there's a whole conversation to be had about integrative and functional medicine versus allopathic medicine. But right now, allopathic medicine is the dominant form. So we need to make sure that we can speak in a convincing and thoughtful way to the allopathic medical community and get their buy-in and show that we have great results. So we do screening. We actively screen both with a psychiatrist as well as a nurse practitioner and MD to make sure there's physical health needs are satisfied. Assuming everything's good, you'll have a prep session with your therapist or your therapeutics team in advance. That'll be done virtually. You'll come in for your treatment. Typically, most courses of treatment are 4 to 6 sessions with the ketamine. Not always. It depends on the individual's specific needs. And during a ketamine experience, you come in the day of, you speak with your therapist, you get comfortable, you come into one of our experience rooms, which are designed to be, very oasis-like is the term I like to use. The ketamine is administered. It usually lasts about an hour to an hour and a half. You have an opportunity to debrief with your therapist in the experience room. And then we have a patient lounge where people can just chill for as long as they want to sort of get back into the routine of their lives. And then, we typically try to do that 2 times in a week. And then early the following week would be an integration session where it's just pure talk therapy. We really just try and take all the awareness and insight and that neuroplasticity that comes with the experiences and turn it into action, whether it's creating new mindsets or new habits or emotional processing, whatever the case may be. And then people would finish, do 2 or 3 modules. So a module being 2 ketamine sessions and 1 integration session over the course of, a few weeks kind of thing, ideally. And that's the experience. And what we've seen coming out of that is, of the patients that we've pulled, people's depression scores often go down from severe, like an average score of 17, down to mild, like a score of 6 or 7. And those benefits are sustained for up to 4 months or more post-treatment. So we're seeing really incredible results. As far as I'm aware, there's no treatment option currently legally available as effective as our ketamine-assisted therapy protocols at Field Trip. I've never seen anything like it. Like ketamine infusion centers, the data suggests the improvements are for a week, a couple of weeks. We're seeing on average 4 months of improvement from the people who responded to our survey. So it's really quite spectacular. It's not up there with what you see with the psilocybin studies, but it's
Mm-hmm.
pretty good, all things considered, given that ketamine was never specifically studied for mental health treatments, and the fact that the protocols we've been innovating on have only been around for the last year or so. So we're very excited and pleased with the outcomes.
Yeah, and so, with everything you guys are currently doing, it's currently just focused on ketamine outside of your psilocybin clinic that's in Amsterdam. But what is the vision for, not only how you're going to expand with different medicines, different psychedelic medicines as they are rolled out with, different FDA approvals, but that's, I guess, question number 1, but also just, can you kind of answer in terms of, your mission of what happens to the world if everything that you want to do with Field Trip goes well over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, over the next 5 years, that's a good question. I don't think we're gonna solve all the problems we've set up to solve in the next 5 years, but it's actually something that I've been wrestling with, which is if we heal everybody's trauma, if we, satisfy everybody's demons and help them go away, and everybody is quote unquote mentally healthy, or whatever term you want to use, how does this world look different? And the answer I come back to is I don't know. I don't know how the world actually looks different. Is it the nature of the human condition to find things to complain about and be upset about? Or can we actually evolve to a next level of consciousness? I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I had the privilege of chatting with Sam Harris at the Code Conference about this specific question, because he pointed out like humans are not physically able. Our biology does not support living in peak experience at all times. So at various times we
Mhm.
have to be out of peak experience. And so it's like, well, what does that mean? Right now we know how far people can go out of peak experience and how depressing and challenging treatment resistant depression or severe depression or major depression can be. But, is there always going to be that lower state? And how bad is that lower state? I don't know. These are questions that vex me. I'm trying to be optimistic that like as soon as we, um, help people achieve a higher state of consciousness, like humanity will actually evolve into the next level of consciousness. But it's a question that I still ponder. Suffice it to say, in the next 5 years, if we can help a lot of people be a lot happier, be better parents, be better friends, be better spouses and partners, be more creative, find more happiness, even though I don't know what the end state of all that work leads to. If we just achieve that, I will be very happy. And if we'll have done our part to help make psychedelics more accessible, both through building that clinical infrastructure, creating data showing their safety and efficacy, creating new molecules, lobbying for legal and regulatory change and insurance coverage, I will be very happy if we've done all that in the next 5 years.
And I think I'll you can never accurately say, right? Like what's going to happen. Let's say if the whole world were to have a field trip experience, sure, you don't, arguably know what would happen. And, to your point, like we do always as humans, like we're designed um, to not sustain those peak experiences. But just from, my personal experience and the personal experience of every single person around me, like if you were to put the entire world's brain in a neuroplastic state and make them more open minded, inherently the world gets better. And so I think that, the guess, although it's a guess, there's enough science and data to prove that like these experiences are propelling people forward. But if you were to put more people's brain in a neuroplastic state, my point is it's just arguably the world gets better. And so I'm excited about what you're doing just from that lens. And I think that, you know, the excitement that I feel because of all of the, the field trips of the world, all of these different companies getting into the space, like the total addressable market is just so massive. So we could have 100 times more, like you're saying, when your answer to competition, and it would still be scratching the surface of the billion people that are suffering from some sort of a mental health condition. So I'm really excited about what you're doing. And to round it out, I have a few more final questions for you. One is just on a logistical front and personal interest front. You know, I think I understand the mission of what you guys are doing and what that looks like in the future, but specifically with actual psychedelics and which ones you're planning to expand into. Can you speak about, I know we have psilocybin and in Amsterdam, but how are you guys planning to roll out different psychedelics across your current clinics?
Sure, but before I answer that, I actually want to thank you. You just gave me a profoundly psychedelic insight, which is I realize I've been asking the wrong question, which is not what does the world look like in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or 50 years if like everybody has a field trip experience and is totally transformed. The question is, what do we want the world to look like? And how do we create that? And it's like that, and that's like the first principle of psychedelics, which is like go in with an intention. So the intention is not about
Mm,
finding the answer; it's about creating the answer. So you've
mm.
totally shifted my mindset about how to think about that question. Thank you. Um, in terms of what happens with Field Trip over the next little while, we're excited to work with all psychedelics. So, ketamine right now in the state of Oregon, we're going to navigate some of the legal considerations, having come out of the cannabis industry and knowing how public markets and state versus federal legal issues get complex. We're actively watching how things roll out from a regulatory perspective in Oregon and how that's going to parlay into our public listing. We have a lot of creative ideas, so it won't stop us, but it does mean that how we structure it may be different. All this
Mhm.
to say is like we're keen to work with psilocybin mushrooms. We're keen to work with synthetic psilocybin, so Compass Pathways psilocybin product or Usona psilocybin product. In other words, like all of these molecules, we want to be able to work with all of them. Truthfully, because even though there's going to be specific approvals, so psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression or major depression, MDMA for PTSD, ask any psychiatrist who's done active underground work with psychedelics or any guide. We benefit from all the different experiences, right? So, there's a lot of people who have major depression or treatment-resistant depression who have trauma underlying it, right? So I think you'll see a lot of off-label use happen quite quickly. It's unfortunate that the insurance paradigms don't often enable that, but I think it'll happen no less, because I think you're going to see the most robust kind of healing and transformation come from active work with all of these molecules. And so we want to be set up to be able to really provide a robust suite of experiences so everything can be personalized to the individual. And then, we're also working on our own psychedelic medicines for FDA approval. FT104, which is our first drug in development, is something that's very similar to psilocybin, both in terms of the subjective experience as well as the objective receptor binding in the brain, but the experience is about half the time. And I know that's sacrilege to a lot of people in the psychedelic space, being like, why would you ever want to shorten the psychedelic experience? And the reason is because we want to make it more accessible. And so that's what this does. So looking forward to working with FT104 and any other molecules that get approved. Really, we want to offer a robust, diversified, personalizable treatment program for people as they come through. So how that looks, how we do that, still to be determined. We got a few years before, or at least 2 years before MDMA rolls out, and there's a lot of questions that MAPS needs to answer before we can figure out how to incorporate that into our businesses. But we continue to have dialogues with them, and I'm sure we'll figure it out quite elegantly.
Amazing. Well, I think, accessibility is key. So I'm super excited to, keep in touch and hear about everything that you're doing. And it's just going to be a really wild few years. So, yeah, it's real and it's happening. And, every day there's a new news article that's sent to me from major publications, just continuing to prove the validity of this space. So very excited about everything that you're doing and to keep following along the journey. My last question for you, given that we are a mushroom specific podcast, although we're supportive of all psychedelics, obviously, you spoke a little bit about your first experiences with psychedelics being psilocybin. And the last question we are asking, all the guests that come on the show is, if you had to pick like one lesson or the most important lesson that psychedelics have taught you, and you can answer this in the terms of, maybe it's a case study you've seen of someone in your network. It doesn't necessarily have to come from within your own personal experience, but either or, what is the greatest lesson that psychedelics have taught you?
Well, there are many. I think the one I always come back to actually comes from my first psychedelic experience, and the actual circumstances around it were mundane, which was we had just left Aurora, the company that acquired our last business. And even though I thought we had been very mature in dealing with some of the outstanding issues, they were still pissed off at us about something, not too severely. It didn't jeopardize the relationship, but there was tension there. And we're like, we don't get it. We don't get it. Like, everything's been above board, totally level. And I remember during that first ever psychedelic experience of mine, I saw the world from their shoes. And I was like, I get it. I get why they're pissed off. It's like, it's not necessarily rational. It's not necessarily right, but I understand why they feel that emotion. And like, that is the truest sense of empathy. People are like, oh, I'm empathetic to your plight. It's like, now, this was like a visceral, embodied empathy, being like, oh, I feel actually what you feel. I understand it now. And that awareness of what true empathy is was so powerful. It just gave me such an insight into seeing the world in such a diversified way. It's been so powerful. And that actually reminds me of one other experience that I'm going to share, even though you only asked for one. I'm going to give you two, two for the price of one. I went for a hike after it wasn't a large dose of psilocybin. And I remember stopping, it was about a year ago, it was autumn and leaves were falling. And I watched one leaf fall, and then I kind of became aware of all the leaves falling at the same time, just in my perspective, my frame of view. And at first I was like, I would never even notice a single leaf falling. I'd never pay attention to it. And now I find myself trying to pay attention to all of these leaves falling at the same time. And then I became so cognizant of how much was happening just in my perspective. There's thousands of leaves falling, there's leaves rustling, there are people walking, there are mice frittering and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, holy shit, I'm only taking in maybe 0.1% of what's happening, and I'm looking at it right now, right? Like, this is in my worldview, and I can only see such a tiny fraction of everything that's happening in this world, let alone when I move over here or around the world. It just made me realize how little, we think we know so much, we think we're so present, but like when you take that second and be like, oh my God, how much is actually happening around me that I'm not aware of? It really made me appreciate how little we see and understand as humanity and how much there is to learn and understand. It was a very eye-opening experience to just appreciate all the wonder around us.
I love that. I think there's a video. I don't know if you've seen this video. Kind of it depicts what you're saying in the sense that it starts with a human eye. It's up close of a human eye, and it zooms out slowly, slowly, slowly until you're seeing this person laying in a field, and then it's going to you can see the state and the country, and slowly, slowly, surely, like you get to see the entire planet Earth and the universe, and just like how little we are in the perspective of everything. And honestly, the smartest people I know are the ones that think they know the least. So there's something to be said for that. Well, Ronan, it was such a pleasure to chat with you, and I'm so glad that it worked out to have this conversation. And I'm also so excited to be able to have, I mean, it sounds like your first public facing interview after you've experienced ketamine. So thanks for sharing your experience and your story. And I'm excited to stay in touch on all the things. For people listening at home, can you let us know, where do you live on the internet, and where can people keep up with you and Field Trip and everything you guys are doing?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for accommodating my request for a Zoom meeting as opposed to an in-person one. If
No
people are
problem.
interested in following us on Twitter and Instagram, it's at Field Trip Health. If you want to follow me personally, it's Ronan D. Levy, Ronan as in D as in David Levy, on Twitter and Instagram. If you're interested in investing in the space, our ticker on the NASDAQ is FTRP. And I think that covers most of the bases of where you can find us. Oh, I guess, and our
Amazing.
website is fieldtriphealth.com. That's an important one still. I forget about that, but yeah.
And we'll link everything up so everything will be clickable. And I'm also an investor in Field Trip. So excited to ride the journey with you guys. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for coming on. We'll chat soon, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. You as well. It's been really nice chatting with you, Alli. I will upload my end of the recording shortly, and we'll go from there.
Thanks for diving into the multiverse with us. If you're interested in being a future guest on the show, sponsorship, partnership, or you're just mushroom curious, we're always looking to expand our mycelium network. Find us on Instagram at Multiverse or online at yourmultiverse.com. See you next week.